Chapter 3. Celebrate Your Right. We're celebrating some huge milestones regarding the right to vote this year, 2020. Did you know that the right to vote and details on who was eligible to vote wasn't included in the Constitution when the U.S. was founded? The Founding Fathers left it up to the states to decide who could vote. As you could imagine, only the privileged were allowed to vote. The states determined men who owned land could vote, except for New Jersey, which let women property owners vote until 1807. At the turn of the 19th century, most states removed property ownership requirements and only gave white men voting rights. It wasn't until after the Civil War that citizenship and voting rights were guaranteed at the national level. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution in 1868 stated that men who were at least 21 years of age were citizens. Many states continued to deny black men the right to vote even though they were American citizens at this time. That's where the 15th Amendment comes in. It was ratified in 1870 and states the right of citizens to vote can't be denied on account of race, color, or prior condition of servitude, aka former slaves. This year, America is celebrating the 150th year anniversary of granting black and other minority male citizens the right to vote. It's estimated that at least 620,000 soldiers died in the Civil War. Black Americans made up 10% of the 2 million strong Union Army at the end of the war, and 40,000 of them died during the war. They fought for a basic human right, the right to be a citizen and receive all the entitlements of citizenship. How happy do you think these men were 150 years ago when they could finally participate in the government? Be grateful for what they sacrificed and achieved for the American people. Don't spit in their faces, so to speak, and lightly regard their accomplishment. Demonstrate your gratitude by exercising your right to vote. Unfortunately, their struggle didn't end there. Many states continued to make it nearly impossible for black and minority men to vote because they instituted poll taxes and literacy tests. Fast forward 95 years to 1965. That's when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the thousands who joined him effected change. They marched from Selma, Alabama, to the state capitol building in Montgomery as a protest to bring attention to their plight and to register to vote. 3 marches took place in March of that year, the first of which is referred to as Bloody Sunday because the protesters were beaten. 3 people died during the marches, 2 at the hands of the KKK. Here's how Dr. King concluded the marches. Let us march on ballot boxes until we send to our city councils, state legislatures, and the U.S. Congress men who will not fear to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with thy God. That's the reason we vote. That's the reason people have willingly sacrificed for this right. Dr. King recognized the spiritual war we're in. As the end of the current age draws near, now, more than ever, we must vote. The marches resulted in passage of the Voting Rights Acts of 1965. It took an incredible 95 years to end the battle the Civil War started. The act prohibited literacy tests and enforced the voting rights guaranteed in the 14th and 15th Amendments through appointed federal examiners that registered people to vote in areas with a history of discrimination. States could no longer have any voting law that resulted in discrimination against racial or language minorities. Prior to this legislation, it's estimated 23% of black Americans were registered to vote. Just a few years later, in 1969, 61% were registered. President Lyndon B. Johnson was a key supporter of the Voting Rights Act. He addressed Congress and asked them to support it. Here's an excerpt from his moving landmark speech. This was the first nation in the history of the world to be founded with a purpose. The great phrases of that purpose still sound in every American heart, North and South. All men are created equal, government by consent of the governed. Give me liberty or give me death. Our fathers believed that if this noble view of the rights of man was to flourish, it must be rooted in democracy. The most basic right of all was the right to choose your own leaders. The history of this country, in large measure, is the history of the expansion of that right to all of our people. Many of the issues of civil rights are very complex and most difficult, but about this, there can and should be no argument. Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is no reason which can excuse the denial of that right. There is no duty which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right. President Johnson believed that ensuring every American citizen is able to vote is our ultimate duty. Let that sink in for a minute. It's a very strong statement, and it carries with it a heavy responsibility. You have a responsibility to vote, because voting is the foundation of democracy. If you choose to shirk your responsibility, you're eating away at what makes America great. The 15th Amendment isn't the only voting legislation we're celebrating in 2020. Let's talk about Susan B. Anthony. I hope you know who she is. If she were still alive, she'd be 200 years old this year. She was a women's rights activist who was prominent in the 19th century. Much like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., she had a dream that she fought hard to achieve, a woman's right to vote. The first women's rights convention in the U.S. was held in 1848, and the right to vote was a topic discussed. Early women's rights leaders believed suffrage was the most effective means in which to change an unjust system. In 1872, Anthony and several other women were arrested after they voted in the presidential election. After 30 years of persuading the public and the government, in 1878, California Republican Senator Aaron A. Sargent introduced the 19th Amendment on her behalf. It didn't pass. Over the years, it was defeated in Congress 4 times by a Democratic Party-controlled Congress. In 1917, the tide began to change. Unfortunately, Anthony wasn't alive to see it. Women who were protesting outside the White House began getting arrested. Many protesters were beaten. Some were jailed or sent to workhouses where they remained for months at a time. Some of the women imprisoned went on a hunger strike to protest their treatment. They were forcefully fed raw eggs through a feeding tube to prevent them from dying while imprisoned. These women who desired to be treated like true citizens of this great country and vote were instead treated like the worst of criminals. Disgusted by the treatment of the protesting women, President Woodrow Wilson pressured Congress to take action on the 19th Amendment. Here's an excerpt from his address to Congress. Are we alone to ask and take the utmost that our women can give, service and sacrifice of every kind, and still say we do not see what title that gives them to stand by our sides in the guidance of the affairs of their nation and ours? We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right? We shall need them in our vision of affairs as we have never needed them before. The sympathy and insight and clear moral instinct of the women of the world. We shall need their moral sense to preserve what is right and fine and worthy in our system of life as well as to discover just what it is that ought to be purified and reformed. Without their counselings, we shall be only half wise. In 1918, when Republicans gained control of the House and Senate, it finally passed. The amendment was worded exactly the same as the first one proposed in 1878. In 1920, 8 million women voted in a presidential election for the first time. This year, come November, presidential election time, Remember what Susan B. Anthony and the other suffragettes endured to secure a woman's right to vote, your mother's right to vote, your wife's right to vote, your sister's right to vote, and perhaps your own right to vote. Celebrate their legacy by voting.